Good morning, everybody. I know it's been a long time since I made a fresh recording for you all. It's gotten busy again. I'm giving a lot of live talks and some tours, and certainly I hope to be able to give a live presentation to you sometime again soon. But until then, at least I have a new video ready for you. This one is titled Oldies But Goodies, kind of like on many of you, I think. We're going to analyze some of the great masterpieces in art. We're going to talk about The Last Supper, the Sistine Chapel, and we're going to start with The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. Let's go. So to me, art appreciation is all about learning to make a connection with art, applying some sort of narrative or having some sort of emotional attachment to a piece of art, or at least starting to understand, why is this piece of art still significant? Why are we talking about art that's been around for 500, 600 years? Why do people come from all over the world to come see particular pieces of art? So today we're going to take on three of those pieces. And we're going to start with The Birth of Venus, shown here. This was painted in 1485 to 1486 by the Italian artist Sandro Botticelli. It hangs in Florence at the Uffizi Gallery, but it was originally commissioned by the Medici family. And the Medicis, of course, were very wealthy. They were a big deal. They had palaces all over Italy. And so this probably was made to hang on one of the palace walls. One of the first things that's really important about this work is it was the first large-scale Renaissance painting with a secular subject matter, not religious subject content. So this was a solely secular work that dealt with mythological subject matter. And there's lots of allegory here. Now, Venus in the middle is based on an antique statue. She has that pose that we've often seen in Roman and Greek statue. And Botticelli had a great reputation as an artist during his lifetime, but then he fell out of favor soon after he passed away and didn't really become interesting, or there wasn't really a resurgence of interest in his work again until the late 19th century. But then it's held. And so now The Birth of Venus is a very well-known work. It's often parodied or made fun of. But here we have the original version. So what are we looking at? We see Venus in the middle, of course. She's flanked by the west wind, and he's entwined with his consort Chloris. And then on the right, we have the attendant Hour, H-O-U-R. And Venus has just emerged from the sea. Venus is the goddess of love and beauty and laughter and marriage. By the way, Venus is the Roman designation and Aphrodite is the Greek designation. So when you hear the term Venus and you hear the term Aphrodite, they're talking about the same goddess. So always the goddess of love and beauty and laughter and marriage. So Venus is born from the sea. She's born from the sea with a rather gruesome story. She comes out of the foam that's generated when Cronus, the sun, flings his father, Uranus's, castrated genitals into the water. So a very violent movement creates this goddess of beauty. And she comes out of the foam, emerges out of the foam, and is carried to land in a scallop shell, which we see here. We can see in the portrayal of the water that there's definitely more motion in the water towards the front of the picture where the shell is coming, and it's much more placid in the background. So what about Venus? We have this beautiful bone structure, elegant and elongated, with these high cheekbones and a strong jaw, and then this flowing hair, which kind of softens the whole thing. Let's look a little closer at her. So Venus, as I said, she's the goddess of love and beauty and marriage, and she comes out of the sea on the scallop shell, and she's in a very classical, elegant Roman statue type of pose. Her skin is very polished, very smooth, almost like marble itself, right? And she's in a very modest position. She realizes that she's come out of the sea and she's unclothed. Maybe she's a little embarrassed by this. So she's covering her private parts as best she can, using her hair to help with that. She has very sculpted features, but I think it's her expression, that far away kind of thoughtful look in her eyes that's both lovely and mysterious. We don't really know what it is that she's contemplating, but there she is in the middle of the picture, having just come out of the water. So we have Zephyr, the west wind, and Chloris, who's also known as Flora in her other country's designation, on the left side of the picture. We can see the wind coming out of Zephyr's mouth, and we see that Chloris and Zephyr are both looking intently at Venus in the middle. Chloris represents spring and flowers and new growth. And we can see that shower of flowers falling down around them. Those are roses. And this was one of the earlier examples that a rose was meant to be a symbol of love. So why is a rose a symbol of love? Mostly because a rose is not just beautiful, but a rose also has thorns. And thorns, of course, can remind us that love can be painful. So that would be why the rose, or that would be the allegorical meaning behind a rose being the symbol of love. And we had talked about the waves. You can see how the waves are just very simply shown there with kind of those little V marks like we learn when we're in art school as children. Then on the other side of the picture, we have hour. And hour is a spirit. There are 4 hours, just like there are 4 seasons. And in this particular case, hour represents spring. How do we know this? We know this because she's bringing a blanket to cover Venus up to help hide Venus's modest parts. A very embroidered, fancy, flower embellished blanket. She's wearing a dress that's also embellished with flowers, with growth. She has a belt of roses around her middle, and she's wearing a necklace of myrtle leaves around her neck. And myrtle stands for everlasting love. So again, we have a lot of allegory here. We also notice the background here. We have these trees, which are actually orange trees, and they're reflecting a beautiful type of light. If we were standing in front of the picture, it would be almost a golden light there reflected in the trees. So we have this beautiful picture full of allegory, full of Greek and Roman references, and that would be why this particular picture has stood the test of time. So now we're going to move on to the Last Supper. So now we've moved to a different part of Italy. We are in Milan, and we are looking at the Last Supper, one of the most famous works in all of the world, done by Leonardo da Vinci from 1495 to 1498. So this particular piece was commissioned for the wall of a Dominican convent. And the reason it took him so long to paint is because this is a very large piece. It's 15 foot tall by 29 feet wide. So it's really more like a mural. Da Vinci made many sketches of this, which actually we still have. So we do know how the original piece looked. But there have had to be several restorations done, because Da Vinci thought that he would try to use an untraditional method to paint this. Normally, you would paint in a traditional fresco way using pigment applied to wet plaster. But sadly, Da Vinci used dry plaster and tempera paint, which is pigment mixed with egg. And because he painted onto the dry plaster and not the wet, the pigment never binded with the plaster. And so as soon as he finished completing this work, not long after, the paint would start to flake off, and the dampness on the wall started to destroy the work. Even though it took Da Vinci 4 years to paint this, it took us almost 22 years in the most recent restoration effort to try to reconstruct the work. And we really only have about half of the work in its original form without restoration. It is one of the tragedies of art that we don't have more of the original work done by Da Vinci. But how did we know what the original work was going to look like if it was destroyed so soon after completion? We know because Da Vinci had several students, and 3 copies of this particular work were made by his students, and so they were used for reference. Now, interestingly enough, during World War II, Santa Maria delle Grazie, which is the name of the monastery, was bombed. But because they thought perhaps it would have been a target, they had shored up that wall. And so the original wall does remain. And you can go visit the Last Supper in its form as it exists today in Milan. So what are we looking at here? Let's talk about the story. So this is a visual interpretation of the story from Gospels, one of the chapters in the New Testament. And there were many different versions painted, and they were depicted from many different points of the betrayal in the story. But in this particular, we're looking at Jesus here in the middle, and it's the actual moment when Jesus discloses to the apostles that one of you shall betray me. So we have reactions from all the apostles, which we'll study in a moment. So this is the moment when Jesus discloses what he knows, and he's instructing them how to eat and drink in future remembrance of him after he's gone. The perspective of this work was very well planned and symmetrical. Da Vinci was a very scientific student. He liked to study anatomy. We've seen the famous picture of the man with his arms out that they use. So in this particular case, he's using that symmetry as a focal device. We have Jesus in the center of the table, and everything else in that picture radiates out. The perspective of the picture takes us way to the very back, and we have Jesus framed here in a window, right? So the vanishing point is directly behind Jesus. By the way, with the window framing Jesus, that's an unusual approach. Normally, we would have had a halo on Jesus, but instead, Da Vinci has framed him with the view to the outdoors. He's framed him with nature because Da Vinci considered nature to be the ultimate statement of the divine. So we have the table, which is blocking the viewer, blocking us from being part of the action. Da Vinci actually wanted us to be witnessing this, not be a part of it. So we're on the opposite side of the table as Jesus and all of the apostles. And Jesus and the apostles are all strung out there in front of us, behind the barrier of the table. So who's who in the picture? Well, we already covered that we have Jesus there in the middle. And going from left to right, we have the names of all the apostles. But you also might notice that they're kind of grouped into threes, like the Holy Trinity. So we have Bartholomew, James the Minor, and Andrew to the far left. And they're expressing shock at what Jesus has just disclosed. We have Judas, Peter, and John closest to Jesus here on the left. Judas is pulled back a little bit, like he's shocked that Jesus has told us what he has. We have Peter, who looks quite incensed, and it's hard to see in this picture, but Peter is actually holding a knife because he's going to go after whoever betrays Jesus. And then we have John, who, interestingly enough, looks a lot like Mary. So we suspected that maybe Da Vinci painted Mary there first and then decided later that Mary would actually be John. And so John, or Mary, is looking a little despaired. She looks very concerned, or he looks very concerned. On the right side, we have Thomas and James Major and Philip. They are looking at Jesus in disbelief. How could you possibly know that somebody is going to betray you? Who would betray you? And then on the far right, we have Matthew, Thaddeus, and Simon. And those three are off in their own discussion, trying to figure out what can they do? How did he know? Who told him? So we have a lot of expressions on everybody's faces here. We have shock, we have disbelief, we have sorrow, and then we have guilt. A couple other things that Da Vinci does here that's interesting. He believed that the positioning of the people and their limbs and their facial gestures were very important. And so he hired actual models while he was painting this picture. And in the case of Judas, he hired an actual criminal because he wanted to be able to get the sneer that a criminal might have being caught red-handed in this kind of situation. We also have a pile of salt that has been spilled near Judas's elbow. What happens today if we spill the salt? Spilled salt is kind of an allegory for bad luck, right? So we don't know whether or not that was what Da Vinci was referencing. Salt was also considered a sign of wealth back in the day, but the fact that there is a pile of salt there probably has some significance. We also notice that there's fish on the table. We don't know whether the fish is eel or herring. And the reason I bring that up is because in Italian, the term for eel is aringa. And aringa is similar to the Italian word for indoctrinate. So maybe Da Vinci is trying to represent indoctrination here. But the Italian word for herring is renga. And renga is the Italian word for somebody who denies religion. So perhaps Da Vinci was trying to represent that Jesus was predicting that the Apostle Peter would deny knowing him. So again, we have a lot of symbolism in this picture. We have a story that we can all somehow narrate to ourselves, whether we're familiar with the Bible or not. But there's a lot happening in this picture. And I think between the story itself, the monumentality of the size of this picture, that would be why this is considered a very important work in art history. So now we're going to move on to the Sistine Chapel. So perhaps you've been lucky enough to visit the Sistine Chapel in person. The Sistine Chapel, of course, is located in Vatican City in Rome, and it was painted by Michelangelo Buonarroti, who we more commonly know as Michelangelo. Michelangelo painted this from 1508 to 1512, so it did take several years. What about the chapel itself? The chapel itself is over 1,600 square feet and had been built for Pope Sixtus. And 16 equals Sistine, and that's how we derive the name, the Sistine Chapel. It was worked on by Botticelli, Perugino, Signorelli, and Ghirlandaio. And that's important because Ghirlandaio was Michelangelo's first teacher. So we're looking at a portion of the ceiling here. The actual ceiling is 112 feet long and almost 43 feet wide. So quite a canvas he had to work on. Now, Michelangelo considered himself more of a sculptor, not a painter. And he was in the process of making a bronze statue for Pope Julius when he was asked to decorate the Sistine Chapel instead. Michelangelo said no thank you, he had no experience in painting frescoes. But Julius insisted, and so that's how Michelangelo grudgingly agreed to paint the ceiling. The ceiling in the chapel was originally blue with stars, kind of like what you might find on a little boy's ceiling these days. But Julius had requested that Michelangelo paint a geometric ornament surrounded by 12 apostles. Michelangelo changed the design dramatically, as we will see in the next slide. So Michelangelo decided that instead of the requested design, that he would paint scenes from the Old Testament. Now, he did paint from a wooden scaffolding that he actually designed himself, but it is an urban myth and not true that he painted lying down. He did stand up. He had to stand up in order to paint accurately, but he did have certain methods that he employed. He had his drawings drawn to scale in his studio workshop by both himself and his apprentices. And then they would bring a stencil to the ceiling. They would attach the stencil to the ceiling and they would dust it with powder. And the perforations in the stencil itself would leave the markings on the ceiling to scale. And so then he was able to draw things in their accurate sizing. Very, very clever. If you'd like to see that in action, I strongly recommend that you rent the movie, The Agony and the Ecstasy. It was a movie done in 1965 and it stars Charlton Heston. It's actually a very entertaining film, but it does a beautiful job of showing the methods that Michelangelo may have employed while he was doing this. It also does show him lying down on the scaffolding, which is probably how the myth began. But he did have neck trouble from standing up and painting looking up all those years, and the neck trouble plagued him for the rest of his life. So despite the fact that this is such a huge piece of art, there's really only one very small corner of one of the scenes that's been destroyed in all of that time. And that was during an accident that occurred at a nearby dynamite factory. So the big explosion actually caused just a little bit of one corner of one scene to fall off. But of course, there have been several restorations since. The latest restoration was a very big effort. It took almost 20 years, and it brightened up all the colors quite significantly. So this room is generally used to select new popes. This is where all of the popes would gather, all of the important people in the church would gather. This has been going on for 500 plus years. And of course, we see the smoke up in the smokestack turning from black to white once the chapel or once the selection has been made within the chapel. So everybody knows of the Sistine Chapel, not just for the artwork, but for the relevance that it has in the Catholic Church. So Michelangelo not only designed the scaffolds, he also designed the frescoes, and the frescoes cover the entirety of the vaulted ceiling. There are over 300 figures that were painted, the smallest of which are the cherubs, and then the largest are the sibyls and the prophets. And the sibyls and the prophets are almost 18 feet tall, and they're in the surrounding border of the scenes that come down the middle. Now, Michelangelo, as I said before, was not happy about this assignment, and he actually took a year off in the middle of the project. He threw his hands up. There was supposedly a dispute about money. He left, and then he was more or less dragged back, kicking and screaming, when Julius suggested that he would hire others to complete the work. So Michelangelo was definitely competitive and didn't want anybody else to take credit for this. When Michelangelo began painting, he painted from the east side of the chapel and in reverse order of the Bible. So one of the most famous scenes is this one here. We have the creation of Adam, and this was done towards the middle of the project. In real life, if you looked up and saw it, it would be towards the middle of the ceiling, and it would be 110 inches by 224 inches, so very large. And what are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing Adam on the left and God on the right. And God is surrounded by angels. But he's also got this kind of reddish brown blob in the background there. What do you think that might represent? Well, in the creation of Adam, this particular scene talks about when God is about to bestow intelligence on man. And so there are some theories that think perhaps that brownish red blob that God is set up against might represent the shape of the human brain. Remember, we talked about the fact that Da Vinci was interested in anatomy. And so we think perhaps this is supposed to be an allegorical representation of the brain. So God is reaching out with one of his fingers towards Adam. Adam is lounging about. He looks almost like, some disgusted teenager that you've asked to perform some sort of chore. And he's got his hand out to God. And we have captured here the exact moment when God and Adam's fingers would meet, and that intelligence, that humanity would be bestowed on Adam by God. So if we were looking at a cartoon of this, we would have lightning flashes and, perhaps large exclamations of pow and bam showing up. But it's interesting that Da Vinci has managed to capture that precise moment just before contact is made. We have both God and Adam looking very sculptural, right? Da Vinci was a sculptor. So we see the ripple of muscle and torso here in Adam. We see the muscular arms in God and the strong, powerful legs. So we see a lot of qualities that one might see in a sculpture here. It's possible that we have a female angel here under God's left arm. Um, it might even be Eve. We don't know for sure. And Adam is, of course, resting on the earth in the form of a green type of meadow. But the poses of both God and Adam here contrast very greatly. And they both have their torsos kind of twisted, again, like sculpture. Here we have another scene from the ceiling. We have the creation of Adam and Eve, and we have the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Da Vinci's very interesting in his approach here. He's put both scenes in the same panel, and he's given us a visual division with the tree in the middle. Wrapped around the tree, we have the serpent. The serpent takes the form of half man and half snake. If we look on the left, we see that the man is reaching out toward Eve. He's probably giving her the apple. And we have Adam and Eve both kind of more in a youthful position, not looking old and haggard yet. So Eve is about to take the apple, which she was not supposed to take. And then on the right side of the picture, we see Adam and Eve being driven out by that angel in red, driven out of Eden by the sword. We see that Adam and Eve have aged considerably, and Eve is cowering and Adam is trying to push the angel aside. So they're ashamed of themselves, as they should have been, because they've disobeyed. They've taken that apple. Like a normal story, this particular scene reads from left to right. And if you were standing in the chapel looking up, you'd be looking up a considerable amount of airspace between yourself and the ceiling. God, of course, appears in 5 stories here. The other 4 stories are human miseries. They're showing the sinners and all the things that weren't supposed to happen. Here we have another scene. We have Noah and the great flood. Again, this tells a story. It's actually telling a story in 4 parts. In the rear of the composition, an ark that's been built. And we have Noah and the people that have listened to Noah on the ark. They're on the water and they're starting to float away. We see the storm clouds on the right side of the picture that are starting to form. And we can see that a considerable amount of water has already come down to earth. Towards the center of the composition, we have people that have jumped into a dish or a boat, looking like they're trying to escape the flood themselves. On the left side of the picture, we have people climbing a mountain, hoping to escape the rising water. And on the right side of the picture, we see people that are seeking sanctuary. It looks like maybe they're in some sort of cave, thinking that the cave is going to protect them. As we know, it doesn't work out for most of the people in this picture, right? We see the ark in the background, and those are going to be the only people that actually survive all of this. So Michelangelo finished painting the ceiling in October of 1512 at the age of 37. It became very, very influential for young painters to come and see and pay homage and look at this masterwork. One last close-up here that I wanted to address. We're looking at the Sibyls, the Prophets, and the Ignudi. Ignudi stands for nude youths. And the nudity shown in the Sistine Chapel actually became a bit of a problem. And later, when a different pope was in charge, he actually had loincloths and fig leaves painted to cover the private parts of several of the nudes. Da Vinci was probably not very happy about that. In the meantime, we have nude youths encircling the 3 main stories that we see on the ceiling, and they're showing reaction to the scenes. And each of the nude youths, as we see here in the center picture, is flanking a giant bronze medallion. The bronze medallions have scenes from the Old Testament painted on them, and there are 10 of those total. The prophets and the Sibyls, all of who were ancient seers who saw that Christ was coming, are also painted along the edges. And then in each corner of the room, we have scenes of the salvation of Israel. The Sibyls and the prophets are based on ancient sculpture, And we can see that in the positioning of their torso. Their torsos are twisted, again, like we talked about, kind of circular bodies, which would be typical in a Michelangelo sculpture. So now you can understand a little more about what you see if you're at the Sistine Chapel. But now we're going to talk about the second part to the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment. So the last piece we're going to talk about today is appropriately titled The Last Judgment. This is kind of part 2 to the Sistine Chapel, and it's painted on the papal altar wall. So this would have been what you were looking at if you were sitting out in the congregation during a service. Pretty intimidating. It's very large, 39 foot by 45 foot, and was again painted by Michelangelo about 25 years after the ceiling was completed. The scene we're looking at here tells of the second coming of Christ. Pretty intimidating. And it's the final eternal judgment of God on humanity. So it completes the story that was painted on the ceiling. Like the ceiling, we have over 300 figures, but unlike the ceiling, we don't have anything containing these pictures. There's no frame or border around this scene. And I think Michelangelo wanted it that way. We can see that the figures in this picture continue all the way to the edges of the wall. What are we looking at? We see Jesus Christ in the center, and he's got kind of a halo or the sun behind him, and Mary is under his arm there in the blue skirt. The composition is laid out almost like a scale, like a weighted scale. We have a slight rise on one side, slightly higher action than what's going on the other side. The side that's a little higher is on the left, and it shows more of those that are going to be confined to hell, the damned. And on the right, it weighs a little heavier. So we have more people on the right, which is the blessed, the side of people that are going to rise to heaven. So we also see the actual ascension and descension to heaven and hell. If you look up, you see that most of the angels have risen. And if you look lower, where the colors have become a little darker and the figures have become more muted, that of course would be the humans that have been damned to hell. Michelangelo also mixed in some mythological figures, which was inspired by Dante's Inferno, a strong piece of literature during the day. The oddity of this particular scene is that Michelangelo includes himself in here, and he takes the form of a flayed or empty shell of a human. You can see him just below Jesus's left leg. He's being held in this kind of saggy looking skin by one of the angels sitting on what looks like a cloud. So you have kind of this scary, droopy looking face with droopy arms and legs. And the reason that he depicted himself this way was that Michelangelo wanted to beg for mercy on having had the audacity to paint this picture in the first place, as if anybody could really show a proper depiction of the Last Judgment. Again, the lack of modesty and the nudity was of concern, and so some fig leaves and loincloths were added later. But there is artistic license that Michelangelo also took here. We have Christ without a beard. We often see Christ with a beard, and so no facial hair on Christ. The angels don't have wings, and Christ is not in a throne, which he also normally would have been during the Last Judgment. So there have been lots of books written about how to interpret these works, all three of the works that we spoke about today. And if it's something interesting to you, I encourage you to look into some of the additional literature. But I hope that you've learned today why these pieces are all considered significant. Thank you for joining me on this most recent talk of three very significant master works. Hopefully you feel like you can understand the significance of those pieces a bit more and apply some of what we talked about to other works of art that you enjoy. I always welcome feedback. I can be reached at the email address here, wendyarticulatingart@gmail.com. This, of course, will be on my YouTube channel where I have other videos recorded. I encourage you to share those with people that you think might be interested. But I truly look forward to being back in front of you and talking to you live and in person in the new year. I wish you all a happy holidays, and I look forward to bringing you another video soon. Thank you.